You might imagine medieval cruelty arriving with the sound of swords, the crash of shields, or the shouting of men on horseback. But often, the cruelest forces in medieval life arrived much more quietly. They did not ride in a fury or shout orders across a battlefield. Instead, they came walking along the same muddy roads that villagers used every day, carrying nothing more threatening than a worn ledger, a pouch of ink, and the quiet, unshakable authority of the state. These were the medieval tax collectors, agents of kings, lords, and bishops, whose power was often felt more sharply than that of knights or soldiers. When you picture a tax collector, don't imagine the modern civil servant sitting behind a desk with fluorescent lights overhead. Picture a traveling official who walked from house to house, manor to manor, village to village, carrying a record of every obligation owed by every family under the jurisdiction of a lord. These records were rarely organized in a way that made much sense to the people being taxed, but they made perfect sense to the authorities who enforced them. You might expect that taxes in the medieval world were simple, but they were anything but. They came in dozens of forms: hearth taxes, bridge tolls, mill fees, grazing rights, market stall dues, road maintenance levies, tithes to the church, fines for failing to maintain ditches or hedges, and even payments simply for the right to remain on land, year after year. Most peasants did not keep track of these things themselves. They didn't need to. The collectors did it for them. Meticulously, relentlessly, and often without mercy. Imagine you are living in a small English village in the late 13th century. Your home is a modest timber dwelling with a thatched roof. Each morning, you walk out to tend your small strips of land in the open fields. The land isn't yours. It belongs to the Lord. You simply have the right to work it, as long as you keep up with your duties. For days or weeks, life might pass in quiet routine. But then a rumor spreads that the king has sent out new officials, or that the sheriff is making his rounds, or that the reeve, your own local tax officer, has updated the village rolls. And suddenly, your heart sinks. The collectors never arrive with dramatic warnings. Their cruelty lies in the way their presence disrupts the fragile balance of everyday survival. A household that is barely holding on can collapse under the weight of a single unexpected fee. A family that planned to store grain for the winter might find that the collector has declared an increase in dues, perhaps for the upkeep of a distant bridge you've never seen, or the repair of a castle wall you've never set foot inside. This was not a system designed with fairness in mind. It was a system designed to keep power centralized. Whether that power belonged to the king, the manor lord, or the nearest monastery. And cruelty, in this context, didn't need to be dramatic. It simply needed to be consistent. You, the listener, can imagine yourself walking alongside the collector as he makes his rounds. He is not an imposing man. His boots are worn. His cloak is patched. His ink-stained fingers reveal hours spent copying numbers into rough parchment books. But despite his humble appearance, everyone steps aside when he approaches. People speak to him cautiously, offering polite greetings tinged with worry. They know that a single line he writes in his ledger might shape their entire year. This collector does not think of himself as cruel. He may even see himself as a servant of a greater order. In his view, without taxes, the roads would fall into ruin, the Lord's hall would decay, and the king's armies would falter. Someone must gather the resources to uphold the system. But if you stop and observe carefully, you notice something important. His pen has more power than most swords in the kingdom. One of the most quietly brutal aspects of medieval taxation was the concept of assessments, the estimated value of a person's goods and labor. These were rarely accurate. The collector often guessed. A man who owned 2 cows might be assessed as owning 3 if the collector believed he was holding back information. A woman who wove cloth might be required to pay a fee based on the assumption that she sold more than she did. And because records were kept unevenly, mistakes carried forward year after year. A miscount in a ledger became a permanent obligation. Imagine your neighbor, an elderly man, pleading that he cannot possibly provide the extra bushel of grain demanded this year. The collector listens patiently, then shrugs. He has his orders. He writes down the fine for non-payment. Another household is now pushed further into debt. Another small cruelty slips quietly into the fabric of daily life. In some regions, collectors worked in teams. One would question the villagers, another would inspect their goods, and a third would record their findings. This inspection could feel invasive, even humiliating. Chickens counted, sheep inspected, tools evaluated, doors opened, granaries examined. It was not done with violence, but with the unsettling authority of someone who could assign penalties with the stroke of a quill. And penalties, in medieval life, were not limited to coins or grain. Labor was often demanded: a day of ploughing a lord's fields, repairing hedges, clearing forests, or transporting timber. Villagers, already struggling to manage their own work, suddenly found their time, their most precious resource, claimed by someone else. The cruelty here, again, is not dramatic. It is slow, administrative, and relentless. Consider the case of the toll age, a tax imposed on towns. Often, arbitrarily, it did not matter how prosperous or poor the residents were. The king simply needed money, and so he declared the amount owed. The burden then fell on collectors and local officials to divide that total among the population. Inevitably, the poorest suffered the most, because wealthier citizens had more leverage to negotiate or influence the assessment. The collector, knowing this, recorded the higher share for those least able to resist. And yet, the tax collector himself often lived precariously. He had his own obligations. If he failed to gather the amount expected, he would be fined or punished by his superiors. So, the cruelty flowed downward, from king to official, to reeve to villager, like cold water dripping through a leaky roof, slow, constant, and impossible to stop. You may also imagine the tension within the village itself. The reeve, often a local resident chosen to manage taxation for the lord, lived among the very people he assessed. He saw them at church, shared their festivals, knew their families, and still, he was expected to enforce the payments, even if it meant turning neighbor against neighbor. Nothing erodes trust like obligations enforced by someone who once stood beside you as a friend. Sometimes, cruelty emerged not from intention, but from uncertainty. A collector might claim that the lord required extra payments that year due to a poor harvest, but whether the harvest was truly poor, or whether the lord simply wanted more grain, villagers rarely knew. They could not verify the accuracy of the numbers. They could only follow orders. The church added its own layer of taxation. The tithe, 1/10 of all produce, was owed to the local parish. Even in years of poor harvest, the tithe was expected. If you had only 9 bushels of grain, 1 still belonged to the church. The collector for the tithe, sometimes a cleric, sometimes a lay officer, arrived separately from the king's or the lord's men. And so, a single household might face multiple collectors in the same season, each with separate demands, none concerned with the others. Imagine the quiet despair of a family who wakes each morning hoping to gather enough food for winter, only to watch their stores disappear into the hands of various officials. They do not starve dramatically. Instead, they survive with less and less, eating thinner pottage, selling tools, borrowing from neighbors, slipping slowly into the shadows of poverty. This slow erosion of security, brought about by the calm, methodical work of collectors, shaped the daily reality of millions across medieval Europe. Yet, despite all this, life continued. People worked, laughed, married, raised children, and gathered around fires to tell stories. Human resilience persisted, even under the weight of obligation. You can imagine them sitting at the end of a long day, sharing quiet conversation about the latest demands, the rumors of new levies, the hope that next year might be easier. As you ease into the second part of this story, imagine the texture of medieval life settling around you more comfortably. Now, the damp chill of earthen floors, the slow crackling of a hearth fire, the faint smell of wool and smoke. The presence of the medieval tax collector, with his ledger and ink, lingers in the background of that world, like a constant draft under the door. But now the question becomes, How did ordinary people live with that presence? How did they adapt, negotiate, endure, and sometimes push back, quietly, carefully, against the machinery of obligation? To understand this, you must return again to the small village setting, a place with perhaps 30 or 40 households, scattered along narrow tracks of hardened dirt. There are no street signs, no paved roads, no neat boundaries. Instead, the land flows from house to yard to field, in an unbroken patchwork shaped by routine rather than design. And within this patchwork, people learn to survive not by resisting the tax system outright, but by mastering the small strategies that made it bearable. One of the most important strategies was simple: knowledge. Medieval villagers may not have been literate in the formal sense, but they were attentive observers. They understood patterns, seasons, and the habits of the officials who governed them. They listened to rumors from travelers, traders, and wandering friars. They watched for changes in the behavior of the reeve. They noted how often the sheriff's riders passed through the region. These details allowed villagers to anticipate when tax rounds were approaching. Those who could manage it stored goods discreetly, hiding grain in pits lined with straw and clay, burying salted meat in barrels under the floorboards, or sending livestock temporarily to a trusted neighbor. These were not acts of rebellion. Rebellion was dangerous, but rather acts of preservation. Quiet, careful decisions made to protect a family's chance of surviving the winter. You might imagine a woman in her small cottage, tucking a packet of dried beans into a nook behind the hearth, or a father carrying a small sack of barley out before dawn to bury it in a field corner overgrown with thistles. These actions were rarely dramatic. They were not performed with urgency or the thrill of escape. Instead, they were done slowly, methodically, with the understanding that the tax collector's visit was inevitable and every overlooked morsel mattered. Collectors were aware of these practices, of course. Many were themselves former villagers or townspeople who had once faced similar worries. But part of the system's cruelty came from its selective enforcement. A collector might overlook a small discrepancy if he believed the household could not withstand harsher demands, or he might choose to punish that same household if he was behind on his quota. There was no consistency, only the shifting balance of necessity and authority. This unpredictability shaped another survival strategy: relationships. A villager who formed a good rapport with the reeve, or with the clerk who kept the records, might find their assessments slightly softened. A collector was more likely to be lenient with households that greeted him politely, offered a cup of ale, or helped him solve local disputes. Small gestures could shift the tone of an interaction, even though the underlying system remained unyielding. In this way, medieval taxation was not only an economic burden but a social one. Households watched each other, observed how their neighbors interacted with officials, and drew their own conclusions about how to navigate the next round of assessments. A family that cooperated too eagerly might be viewed with suspicion. Another that resisted too strongly risked the attention of the sheriff. The balance, like everything in medieval life, was delicate, yet some forms of strategy required collective action. In many villages, people gathered at the churchyard after Sunday Mass to discuss the latest demands or rumors from the Lord's manor. These quiet gatherings were rarely confrontational. Instead, they focused on managing expectations, sharing information, and deciding whether the village should collectively petition for reduced dues. A petition might involve sending 2 or 3 respected villagers to the manor house to speak on behalf of everyone. The lord or his steward might listen sympathetically or dismiss the matter entirely. But even the act of petitioning offered a small sense of agency. Sometimes, villagers formed informal agreements to rotate who bore the heaviest burden each year. If one family faced a poor harvest, the others might offer grain or labor, so the deficit would not be obvious to the collector. This mutual support was not driven by charity alone. It stemmed from the knowledge that a weakened household threatened the stability of the whole village. If too many families fell behind on taxes, the Lord might impose harsher measures on everyone. The church also played a role, though not always a comforting one. Priests collected tithes and reported delinquencies to higher ecclesiastical authorities. But they also heard confessions, listened to worries, and offered counsel on how to remain faithful while navigating financial hardship. In some cases, priests quietly advised households on when collectors were coming or how to phrase a petition more effectively. Other priests were stricter, insisting that tithes were divine obligations not to be questioned. You can picture the unease of a villager wondering which type of priest lived in their parish. And beyond the village level, entire regions endured periods of heavier taxation brought on by war, famine, or political turmoil. The 100 Years' War, for example, placed enormous pressure on English communities as kings imposed new levies to fund armor, weapons, and the salaries of soldiers. These taxes often came suddenly, announced by criers in marketplaces or by the sheriff's men as they rode through rural paths. Villagers barely able to sustain themselves from previous demands found new ones piled on top. This pressure led to yet another survival strategy: migration. People quietly slipped away from villages, seeking anonymity and opportunity in towns or distant manors. A family might disappear overnight, their cottage left abandoned, the hearth still warm from the previous day's fire. This was an act of desperation, for leaving a manor without permission was illegal. But some villagers deemed the risk worth taking if they believed the collectors would claim everything they had left. The authorities viewed such migrations with frustration. Lost tenants meant lost revenue. So, laws were enacted requiring laborers to remain on their lord's land, especially after the Black Death reduced the workforce dramatically. Collectors were then tasked not only with gathering taxes, but with ensuring that people stayed put, a responsibility that added another layer of restraint to daily life. Even towns had their own forms of quiet cruelty. Urban tax collectors were often more systematic, keeping detailed records of every shop, stall, and household. But townspeople also had more access to money, property, and legal tools to negotiate their assessments. Guilds sometimes shielded their members from harsh collections or pressured officials to reduce levies that threatened local commerce. And in some towns, people banded together to purchase collective charters from the king documents that limited what taxes could be imposed without local consent. These charters were expensive, but provided a measure of security that rural villages rarely enjoyed. Meanwhile, the collectors themselves lived in a strange position between authority and vulnerability. Though they wielded power, they were often resented by the communities they visited. Many collectors feared retaliation, especially in regions known for boundary disputes or long-standing feuds. Some traveled with escorts, others moved quickly, conducting assessments with a briskness that betrayed their unease. Imagine a collector lodging in a small inn at night, eating a simple meal while the innkeeper avoids eye contact. His presence is tolerated, but the atmosphere remains tense. He knows that the taxes he gathers will likely strain the very households he depends on for hospitality. And yet, he must complete his route. His position, and sometimes his freedom, depends on it. The cruelty of the system, then, was not only experienced by the taxed, but also perpetuated by those who administered it. It was a chain of obligation, stretching from the king's treasury down to the humblest cottage. No link could be removed without disturbing the rest. And so, medieval people developed a final, essential survival strategy: endurance. They learned to live with uncertainty, to adapt to changing demands, to find comfort in the rhythms of daily life. Despite the constant presence of authority, they became experts in patience, negotiation, compromise, and quiet defiance. These skills may not seem dramatic, but they were the foundation of survival in a world where obligations pressed in from every direction. Yet, one lingering question remains. If the system was so burdensome, what happened when the pressure became too great, when patience ran out, and endurance could no longer sustain the fragile equilibrium of medieval life? As you settle into the final section of this first story, imagine the quiet weight of medieval life that we've built so far. The collector's ledger, the villager's whispered strategies, the slow churn of obligations that wrapped around rural life like an invisible net. All of these threads created a system that, for the most part, people tried to navigate through patience, endurance, and small acts of negotiation. Yet there were times when the pressure became too great, times when a village, a town, or even a nation reached a breaking point and could no longer hold the burden placed upon it. And so we turn now to those moments when the quiet cruelty of medieval taxation met the louder, more desperate voice of human resistance. Breaking points rarely arrived suddenly. They accumulated over seasons, years, even like water in a swollen river. A poor harvest, followed by a new royal levy. A war tax imposed just as plague reduced the workforce. A reeve replaced with a stricter one. A tithe collector, demanding arrears from families still recovering from illness. Each added weight pushed the village closer to the edge. In many cases, the first sign of rising tension appeared in the churchyard after Mass. Villagers gathered not with shouts or anger, but with low, cautious voices. They compared notes on their obligations. They wondered aloud whether the king truly needed the funds demanded. They debated whether the Lord's steward had been fair or whether he had been increasing fines for reasons of his own. These conversations were not revolutionary in intent. They were expressions of shared exhaustion. But exhaustion can be a powerful force when enough people feel it at the same time. There were several kinds of responses to unbearable taxation. Some were quiet acts of defiance. Others grew into open revolts. Many remained somewhere in between, a persistent, low-level resistance that altered the relationship between rulers and the ruled in lasting ways. One of the most common forms of pushback was the refusal of labor. While peasants were legally obligated to perform service on the Lord's land, they sometimes found ways to delay, excuse, or minimize their participation. A villager might claim illness, or the urgent need to repair his own roof, or the necessity of preparing fields for the next planting. A woman responsible for weaving cloth owed to the manor might intentionally spin slowly, reducing her output. These refusals were rarely outright. Outright refusal could be punished severely, but they chipped away at the manor's expectations. Administrators noticed, but they also knew that punishing an entire village risked undermining production. Another form of resistance involved the careful manipulation of information. Villagers might underreport harvest yields, rotate livestock to avoid inspection, or collectively agree to present lower numbers for communal resources, like meadows or shared mills. This sort of evasion required trust. If one family broke the agreement and revealed the truth to the collector, perhaps in exchange for a lighter personal assessment, the entire effort collapsed. Mutual suspicion always lingered in the background, reminding villagers that survival depended on cooperation. But cooperation was fragile. Yet when these quiet strategies failed, tensions could crystallize into something larger. You might recall, for instance, the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. A major example of what happened when taxation pushed ordinary people beyond their limits. For years, England's kings had imposed new and increasingly burdensome poll taxes to fund military campaigns in France. Each person, regardless of wealth, was required to pay the same fixed amount. The poorest suffered the most. The collectors, pressured by royal officials to gather the full amount, sometimes resorted to intimidation or invasive searches. In some villages, collectors demanded proof of age from young women, an act that struck many households as both humiliating and deeply inappropriate. The combination of economic strain and personal violation ignited outrage. When a group of villagers in Essex refused to allow collectors into their homes, violence broke out. The sheriff intervened. Tension spread. Within weeks, thousands of peasants and townspeople from Kent, Essex, and beyond marched toward London. Their grievances varied: land rents, feudal duties, legal abuses, but taxation was the spark. This revolt was far from a heroic uprising in the modern sense. Many participants were driven by desperation rather than ideology, and yet, their message was clear. There were limits to what people could endure. The revolt was suppressed, and many leaders were executed, but the shock it delivered to the political system was lasting. Kings became more cautious about imposing direct taxes on peasants. Local resistance became an ever-present threat that rulers could not ignore. Another example can be found in medieval France, where frequent war taxes the tale, and others fell heavily on rural communities. During the 14th and 15th centuries, As the 100 Years' War drained resources, French officials imposed repeated levies to rebuild fortifications, equip armies, and ransom captured nobles. Villagers, already suffering from raids, disease, and famine, increasingly refused to pay. Some fled into forests, others fortified their villages. Others still negotiated collectively with tax collectors, demanding reductions or longer deadlines. These were not organized rebellions, but they reflected a deep shift. Taxation could not simply be imposed. It had to be justified, or at least softened, if authorities hoped to maintain stability. But perhaps the most persistent form of resistance came not from revolt, evasion, or migration, but from something much subtler: the gradual reshaping of expectations. Over time, medieval communities learned to negotiate their obligations more effectively. They appealed to royal courts. They brought grievances to bishops. They petitioned lords with increasingly sophisticated arguments about custom and precedent. And sometimes, these strategies worked. A village might win the right to pay taxes in grain instead of coin. A town might purchase a charter, limiting the conditions under which taxes could be increased. A guild might secure privileges protecting its members from arbitrary levies. These small victories accumulated, century after century, slowly redistributing power between rulers and the ruled. Even the collectors themselves felt the effects of these changes. In some regions, their authority became more bureaucratic, tied to written rules rather than personal discretion. Records became better organized. Disputes could be appealed. Standards were set for assessments. While these developments did not eliminate the burden of taxation, they provided a modest safeguard against its harshest abuses. Of course, medieval taxation never disappeared. Neither did the frustrations it caused. But the responses of ordinary people through endurance, negotiation, and the occasional outburst of rebellion left a historical legacy that shaped the governance of later centuries. For instance, the concept of parliamentary consent for taxation in England grew partly from the Crown's recognition that imposing taxes without approval risked revolt. The Estates General in France emerged as a platform for negotiating fiscal demands. Towns across Europe insisted on charters and privileges that limited arbitrary financial burdens. These institutions, though imperfect, became the seeds of more participatory forms of governance, and beneath those political shifts lay the enduring memory of quiet cruelty, the knowledge of what it felt like to live under the unblinking authority of men with ledgers. Even today, the medieval tax collector lingers in history's imagination as a symbol of slow, methodical pressure, a reminder that power does not always arrive with violence. Sometimes, it arrives with ink. As you reflect on this first story, consider how the lives of ordinary medieval people, farmers, weavers, herders, widows, clerks, were shaped by forces they could not control, but still learned to navigate. Their strategies, compromises, and resiliences became part of a long human story. The story of managing obligation, resisting injustice, and surviving systems that demand more than people can comfortably give. Before you enter the world of the bishop's courts, pause for a moment and imagine the atmosphere of a medieval cathedral city. It is not merely a place of worship, it is an entire administrative landscape, layered with authority and expectation. You walk slowly through its narrow streets, noticing the worn stones beneath your feet. Stones polished smooth by generations of pilgrims, clergy, merchants, and petitioners. The great cathedral rises above everything, its towers visible from miles away, casting long, unshifting shadows across the surrounding houses and workshops. This is not just a religious structure. It is the center of an elaborate legal system, one that touched the lives of nearly everyone in medieval Europe. And though it operated with formality and ceremony rather than brute force, its influence could be quietly, profoundly cruel. The bishop's court, also known as the ecclesiastical court, was responsible for overseeing an astonishingly wide array of matters: marriage disputes, inheritance conflicts, moral offenses, tithes, clerical misconduct, accusations of heresy, breaches of oath, wills, and even some cases of debt. Many modern listeners imagine church courts as distant, abstract institutions, but in medieval life, they represented one of the most consistent and intrusive authorities people encountered. You, as an ordinary villager or townsman living in the 12th or 13th century, might never meet the king's justices. You might rarely hear about the Lord's steward, but you could easily find yourself summoned before the bishop's court. And the summons would not come with shouting or threat, it would come quietly, written carefully on a small slip of parchment, delivered by a clerk or summoner who recited your name in a voice that carried neither anger nor compassion, simply obligation. This quietness, this administrative calm, was where the cruelty often lay. Imagine now that you are standing inside the bishop's consistory court, a chamber usually located near or attached to the cathedral itself. The space smells faintly of incense, mixed with the damp scent of stone walls. Wooden benches line the room. At the head sits the bishop's official, often a trained canon lawyer, known as the officialis. He is not a warrior. He carries no weapon. Instead, he has a desk filled with parchment rolls, a set of wax seals, and an ink-stained quill. Yet from this seat, he can determine fates as surely as any soldier. In front of him stand the people summoned today. A widow disputing the validity of her late husband's will, two neighbors arguing over a boundary mark, a priest accused of failing to maintain proper conduct, and a young couple asked to prove that their marriage was legally valid. Their concerns could not be more different, yet the court's reach encompasses them all. One of the most striking features of the bishop's court was its reliance on procedure. Everything was recorded. Everything required proper form. Witnesses swore oaths. Clerks wrote down testimonies, word for word, and the entire process could drag on for weeks, months, sometimes years. For the wealthy or educated, this was merely inconvenient. For ordinary villagers, it could drain time, resources, and emotional energy they could scarcely afford to lose. Consider, for instance, a marriage case. Marriage in medieval Europe was legally complex. It was not always about ceremonies in churches. It was about verbal consent, witnesses, betrothals, and promises made privately or publicly. If someone disputed the validity of a marriage, perhaps a parent opposed the match, or another suitor claimed a woman had previously pledged herself to him, the bishop's court intervened. And because marriage affected inheritance, property rights, and familial alliances, the court treated these disputes with painstaking seriousness. You might find yourself questioned repeatedly about when you exchanged vows, who heard them, whether you had touched hands, whether you had consummated the bond, and whether there had been any impediment, kinship, previous promises, or coercion. These questions, personal and intrusive, were asked in a calm, almost detached tone. The court wasn't trying to shock or shame you. It was simply doing its job. And yet, the effect could be deeply humiliating and disruptive. Another frequent matter before the bishop's court was the enforcement of moral discipline. The court prosecuted adultery, unnatural behavior, failure to attend church, disputes with clergy, and even gossip or slander in some places. Punishments rarely involved physical harm. Instead, they involved public penance, fines, or temporary excommunication. But in medieval society, where community acceptance meant survival, being ordered to stand barefoot at the church door, to confess publicly, or to make pilgrimage as penance could feel profoundly cruel. You might imagine a woman required to kneel during Sunday Mass in a special place near the front of the church, visible to the entire village, because she had insulted a neighbor. Her punishment wasn't violent. It was social exposure, given weight by religious authority. People didn't jeer or mock her. They simply looked quietly, and the message carried deeper than any shouted sentence. Another man, fined for failing to pay tithes, might have his goods seized by the church until he complied. Again, there was no violence, only a legal process enforced with precision. But when those goods included tools or livestock essential for survival, the cruelty became evident. A family could be pushed into hardship not because of dramatic punishment, but because the court followed its procedures thoroughly, unemotionally, and without flexibility. This was one of the defining features of the bishop's courts. The impartiality of paperwork. Once a case was opened, once a fine was recorded, once an oath was documented, the process took on a life of its own. Clerks continued transcribing, judges continued scheduling hearings, summoners continued delivering citations. And you, the person caught in this administrative current, could do little to alter its course. Yet not everything in the bishop's courts was severe. These courts also offered protections. They provided legal recourse for widows, defended clerics from unfair lay prosecution, regulated wills to prevent fraud, and oversaw charitable bequests and hospital foundations. For many medieval people, the church court was the only accessible place to seek justice when harmed, slandered, or denied rightful inheritance. And still, even in these helpful roles, the court's silence and formality could feel oppressive. The system was built on rules, precedents, and canon law concepts that ordinary villagers did not fully understand. A person might win their case, yet emerge exhausted and indebted from the long ordeal. A widow might secure her right to dower lands, but lose months of labor on her own fields due to repeated visits to the court. A man might prove his innocence, but suffer the humiliation of public suspicion until the verdict was finally announced. And behind all of this lay the bishop, the distant figure whose authority set the tone for the entire system. You rarely saw him directly. His presence hovered like a cool shadow across the administrative world he governed. His wealth came partly from fines and fees associated with court cases. His reputation depended on maintaining order and moral discipline. And his officials, well-trained and articulate, spoke on his behalf with the certainty that their decisions were backed by the church's legal tradition and spiritual authority. In many ways, the bishop's court represented a subtle kind of cruelty, one rooted not in malice, but in the rigid, unyielding machinery of institutional power. It was a cruelty of procedure, of paperwork, of expectation, a cruelty of time taken, privacy invaded, reputations questioned, and livelihoods disrupted. And yet, people continued to live under its authority year after year. They learned the rhythms of the summonses, the patterns of the officials' questions, the quiet strategies for managing evidence and testimony. Some feared the court, others used it as a tool. Most accepted it as an inevitable part of life. But beneath that acceptance, a lingering question remained, one that echoed through villages, towns, and even the grand halls of the cathedral precinct. When you picture a medieval king, you might imagine someone towering above rows of armored knights, a figure surrounded by banners, trumpets, and all the symbols of royal power. But to understand the world of King John, you must look downward, not upward. His power did not come from grand ceremonies or battlefield triumphs. It came from paper, ink, seals, and ledgers. It came from clerks hunched over oak desks, tallying debts owed by men who had no way to escape them. It came from messengers riding muddy tracks with writs demanding fines, land seizures, and payments that eroded entire families over a single winter. In John's England, cruelty was not always loud. Sometimes it was carved into parchment. You sit again in the quiet of that world, imagining the soft rustle of scrolls as they unfurl. The text is cramped, dense, and practical writs demanding hostages, orders to extract unpaid scutage, demands for knights to present themselves or suffer the consequences. Nothing in these documents announces itself as dramatic or emotional, yet each order shaped a life, sometimes ending one. This is the machinery King John perfected, the ability to reach into the daily existence of every noble and many commoners, tightening his grip until the very act of living became expensive. Around 1208, after John's quarrel with the Pope escalated into open conflict, England fell under papal interdict. You may imagine religious life grinding to a halt, but the experience was much more mundane and unsettling. Bells fell silent. Marriages could not be performed publicly. The dead were buried in unconsecrated ground. People went about their lives under an ambient sense of spiritual uncertainty, as if something was fundamentally off in the world. It dragged on for 6 long years. But while the people suffered the spiritual consequences, John focused on the administrative opportunities the interdict created. Church lands, some of the wealthiest estates in England, were seized by the crown. Their annual revenue flowed directly into John's treasury. It was perhaps one of the most lucrative punishments in medieval English history. You can picture John checking the tallies, amused by the ease with which church income could be captured. The sheriffs reported heightened revenues. The exchequer scribes wrote quickly to keep up. This was not cruelty through spectacle. It was cruelty through efficiency. Many nobles felt this tightening pressure. The aristocracy still expected kings to be demanding, even severe. But John's methods crossed a line that was rarely approached. He turned feudal obligations into a financial weapon. Instead of simply requesting military service, he charged scutage, a fee that allowed nobles to pay instead of serving in war. That practice was common enough, but John raised the amount again and again, to the point where it no longer resembled a fee but a threat. Pay or face seizure of property. Pay or send a son or nephew as a hostage. Pay or expect a visit from royal officials who would interpret your rights in the narrowest way possible. One baron, William de Brozé, felt this escalating pressure more than most. It began with manageable obligations, the sort any noble might owe. But as William fell out of political favour, John used every tool at his disposal. Debts increased mysteriously. Land was confiscated. Demands were made for hostages William's own sons. When William fled, John pursued him with an almost personal anger. William's wife and eldest son were captured. Their fate is documented only in chilling fragments. They were starved to death while imprisoned at Corfe Castle. Even royal clerks, usually neutral observers, recorded the event with uncharacteristic clarity. They died, one entry says, by the will of the king. This incident did not happen in a battlefield, nor during revolt. It occurred through administrative decree, and this is what made John fundamentally different from the kings who came before him. His most feared weapon was not the sword, it was the writ. Yet there were moments when John's cruelty broke past bureaucracy and entered the physical world. Consider the treatment of hostages' children who were taken from their families, not as prisoners of war, but as collateral for their parents' loyalty. This was a long-standing medieval practice. But under John, the treatment grew harsher. Hostages could be blinded, mutilated, or even worse, executed, not for their own actions, but in response to the perceived disloyalty of others. You imagine a noble child, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, living in the stone chambers of a royal fortress, surrounded by unfamiliar servants, and attempting to understand why they were there. Their parents paid, bargained, or submitted to the king because their child's life depended on it. John himself seemed oddly comfortable making decisions that involved human suffering at a distance. Chroniclers repeatedly observed the coldness with which he ordered punishments. When a royal judge threatened to hang a group of Welsh hostages, John was said to have responded with a chilling ease. "Hang them all, and I shall send more trees from England for the gallows if needed." Modern historians debate the exact wording, yet the sentiment fits what is known of his character. Efficient, detached, and disturbingly casual. You might imagine that such cruelty made John a fearsome figure in military matters. But his campaigns often reflected the same mixture of calculation and mismanagement that marked his domestic rule. The loss of Normandy in 1204, the event that destroyed the Angevin Empire, was not the result of glorious defeat. It was the result of hesitation, poorly coordinated logistics, and a failure to maintain the support of key nobles. While Philip II of France moved swiftly, John moved cautiously, so cautiously that he lost the initiative entirely. Normandy fell piece by piece. Castles surrendered. Local lords defected. Entire regions simply accepted French rule because John never sent adequate reinforcements. You stand in the echoing silence of a surrendered Norman castle. The garrison has left through the gate. The French banners rise. No battle occurred here. Only paperwork and decisions made hundreds of miles away. That is the tone of John's reign. Anticlimax. but costly anticlimax. Still, John attempted to reclaim his continental lands. This required money, huge amounts of it, and so the financial pressure on England increased yet again. You can almost sense the collective exhale, the fatigue that settled across the barons as yet more taxes were levied. Many had supported John after the death of his brother Richard, believing that order and stability would follow. Instead, they found themselves in a landscape of relentless extraction. By 1212, some barons began plotting rebellion in secret. John's spies, he maintained an impressive and sometimes eerie intelligence network, uncovered the plan. Several rebels were imprisoned, some were executed. But the deeper consequence was psychological. John now believed that treason lurked everywhere. He became more suspicious, more controlling, more inclined to interpret hesitation as disloyalty. It was during this period that the story of Peter of Pontefract emerged, a hermit who claimed that John would lose his kingdom within a year because God was punishing him. John ordered Peter and his son brutally executed, but afterward, when the predicted year arrived, John panicked and seemed genuinely afraid. Chroniclers noted that he rarely slept deeply, often waking and refusing to rest in the same room 2 nights in a row. His cruelty, when turned inward, became fear. Then came 1214, and the disastrous campaign at Bouvines. John's final attempt to reclaim his lost territories failed catastrophically. When he returned to England, he brought with him not triumph, but desperation. The barons, long exhausted, now saw opportunity. They demanded reforms, limits on royal power, guarantees that rights would be honoured, and protections against the arbitrary fines and seizures that had defined John's rule. You picture a cold morning at Runnymede, June 1215. The barons, armoured and guarded, stand across from the king's retinue. John, who had spent years tightening his grasp on the kingdom, now found himself forced to loosen it. The document he sealed, Magna Carta, reads like a list of corrections to John's abuses. No more arbitrary fines, no more unlawful imprisonment, no more exploitation of widows, no more seizing land without lawful judgment. Every clause points to a specific wound inflicted during his reign. Yet even here, nothing was truly resolved. John agreed because he had no choice. He requested copies of the charter, even seemed cooperative. But privately he wrote to the Pope, asking for the document to be annulled. You can picture the clerks again, writing quickly as John dictated letters dripping with resentment. The machinery of his rule remained active until his final months. The barons, realizing he had no intention of honoring his promises, revolted. Civil war began. This is where the story pauses, with the kingdom on the verge of fracture. John's cruelty, long tolerated or endured, had finally created a crisis that threatened the very stability of England. Armies gathered, castles prepared for siege. And John, facing one of the most serious rebellions in English history, prepared to use every remaining tool, military and administrative, to preserve his rule. As you settle into the final section of this story, imagine England in the early summer of 1215. The heat is muted beneath clouded skies. Fields are cautiously tended. Villages hum with everyday life. Beneath the calm surface, however, tension coils like a tightly wound spring. King John has spent years extending the machinery of his authority through writs, fines, hostages, and legal decrees. But that machinery is now strained to its limits. The barons, emboldened by shared exhaustion and outrage, demand limits on his power. The kingdom balances on the edge of civil war. What makes John's story especially instructive and quietly cruel in its own right is that his power was mostly bureaucratic. He did not need to fight every battle in person. His writs, seals, and royal officials carried out much of his work, slowly eroding the wealth, freedom, and patience of nobles and commoners alike. These were men and women who endured subtle cruelties, repeated fines, confiscations, the constant presence of royal agents who could appear at any hour, demanding payment or obedience. Over time, the weight of expectation wore on the kingdom like a persistent winter wind. Yet, As Section 2 concluded, John's relentless centralization of power and obsession with revenue produced consequences he could not control. The barons' rebellion was both an inevitability and a reflection of the limits of administrative cruelty. Even a king with writs, ink, and ledgers could not override the social and political realities of medieval England. People, when pushed beyond endurance, found ways to resist. By June 1215, at Runnymede, the confrontation took on the slow, procedural character that had defined John's reign. It was not a dramatic battlefield clash, but a negotiation under duress. Barons presented demands in writing. Witnesses observed, and legal counsel canons and clerks ensured that every detail conformed to accepted norms. It is easy to overlook how meticulously bureaucratic this scene was, but this meticulousness is part of the quiet cruelty of John's era. Disputes were rarely sudden or dramatic. They unfolded through careful, exhausting process, designed to wear down those involved. When Magna Carta was sealed, it addressed grievances that were painfully specific: protection against unlawful imprisonment, limits on excessive fines, rights for widows regarding inheritance, restrictions on seizing property without due process. Each clause reads as a corrective to John's previous actions, each a testament to the subtle ways he had pushed the limits of tolerance. Yet, even with the charter, John's authority remained intact legally, symbolically, and institutionally, but now constrained by precedent. The seeds of rule-bound governance, of legal expectation, were quietly planted. John's death in October 1216, during a campaign in eastern England, ended his personal cruelty, but did not immediately resolve the tension he had created. The kingdom faced continued rebellion, negotiations, and shifting allegiances. Yet, in retrospect, his reign demonstrates something striking about medieval power. Cruelty need not be dramatic to be profound. It could unfold in quiet increments, through paperwork, fines, hostages, and administrative rigor. It could grind down families, exhaust barons, and shape the expectations of generations without the clash of swords. You might now picture the lives of those who endured his rule. Peasants, relatively distant from John's immediate reach, still felt the effects. Increased scutage often meant higher rents, greater obligations, and reduced flexibility for survival. Merchants and townspeople were forced to pay levies that drained the slow accumulation of wealth that allowed them to trade, expand, or invest in improvements. Nobles faced legal manipulation, threat to heirs, and the terrifying uncertainty that hostages represented. The cruelty was structural, omnipresent, and often impersonal, but its effects were deeply human. At the same time, John's reign left lasting lessons about governance, power, and the limits of administrative cruelty. Magna Carta, though imperfect and immediately contested, became a cornerstone for later ideas of law, consent, and limits on authority. It introduced principles that continue to resonate. No one, not even the king, is above established legal constraints. Even the most relentless systems can be restrained when those governed find mechanisms to assert boundaries. Ordinary people, when coordinated or patient enough, can temper the excesses of authority. Yet even this lesson carries a subtle reminder. The machinery of cruelty is often most effective when slow, methodical, and procedural. Sword-wielding tyrants are visible. Administrators like John, operating through writs and accounts, are less visible. Their reach is steady, incremental, and exhausting. Families experience it in the slow erosion of wealth, rights, and security. Generations of barons remember it in painstakingly preserved records, legal precedents, and treaties that are negotiated under pressure rather than inspired by goodwill. You can imagine looking at the ledger. John kept the careful notations of fines, hostages, and payments collected across the kingdom. It is not dramatic. There is no blood, no triumphal fanfare. Yet when the ledger is examined closely, it reveals the contours of human suffering and resilience. Each entry is a reminder of how authority, exercised efficiently and relentlessly, can impose profound consequences without the theatrics of battle. Cruelty, in this context, is the patient unfolding of rules, obligations, and unyielding expectation. As the kingdom gradually stabilized under John's son, Henry III, and as rebel barons were placated or subdued, the lessons of administrative cruelty became part of the fabric of governance. Kings learned to temper arbitrary fines, respect charters, and negotiate with nobles, all the while maintaining the machinery that ensured regular income. Ordinary people, in turn, learned to navigate the slow rhythms of legal systems, clerical oversight, and taxation. Survival, in medieval England, depended as much on understanding the mechanisms of authority as on physical labor or battlefield prowess. To understand the siege of Stirling Castle, you must first imagine the landscape of medieval Scotland in the early 14th century. Rolling hills, dotted with scattered farms, thick forests where deer and wild boar roamed, and rivers that cut deep gullies into the earth. The castle itself sits atop a craggy hill, rising above the town with stone walls that have withstood generations of weather and attack. Its towers are not simply defensive structures. They are symbols of authority, of dominance over the surrounding lands, and of the uneasy balance between power and survival. Life for the people around Stirling was measured in small routines, punctuated by the distant threat of conflict. Farmers tended to their fields in silence, mindful of both the seasons and the shifting allegiances of lords, kings, and mercenaries. Merchants carried grain, cloth, or livestock along narrow paths, calculating which roads were safe and which might attract soldiers looking for provisions, or worse. And all the while, the castle loomed above, a silent sentinel capable of enforcing control or denying resources, depending on whose banner flew over its walls. The siege we now focus on was not famous for large-scale battles or dramatic charges of knights in shining armor. It was remembered, instead, for the slow grind of military logistics, the quiet desperation of the civilian population, and the patient endurance of those defending and attacking the fortress. In many ways, it exemplifies the subtle cruelties of medieval warfare, where starvation, disease, and administrative inefficiency were often more lethal than swords. At the heart of this siege was Robert the Bruce, King of Scots. His campaign to consolidate control over Scotland was marked by strategic patience, choosing battles that could be won through preparation rather than brute force. Stirling Castle was a focal point because it controlled access to the central lowlands, making it a linchpin in the struggle for authority. Whoever held Stirling could project power across much of the surrounding territory. Whoever failed to capture it risked a prolonged stalemate that strained manpower and resources. The defenders of the castle were a combination of local garrison troops, mercenaries, and loyal retainers appointed by the English crown. They were well aware that a siege could last months or even years. Supplies were limited, and morale depended on the knowledge that reinforcements might arrive or might not. Their daily life was a careful choreography of rationing, repair, and vigilance. Soldiers polished weapons, inspected walls, and rotated watch shifts. Civilians inside the walls, blacksmiths, cooks, clerks, and servants kept the routines of life going, managing stores of grain, wells, and livestock. Every day was a negotiation with scarcity. Outside the castle, Robert's forces faced a different kind of challenge. A besieging army needed to be supplied as well, often across difficult terrain and through hostile territory. Horses required fodder, men required food and shelter, and siege engines demanded both timber and skilled operators. Unlike a modern army that might receive regular resupply shipments, a medieval force relied on local resources, requisitioned from nearby villages. This meant that the siege itself could impose hardship on civilians, who were forced to give up grain, cattle, and labor. The line between the enemy and the local population blurred, as survival became a shared struggle under the pressure of military necessity. It is easy to underestimate the patience required in such situations. A siege could involve days, weeks, or months in which little seemed to happen. Archers maintained their posts, engineers inspected fortifications, and supply lines creaked under the weight of necessity. Occasionally, small skirmishes or sorties would break the monotony, but these were minor compared to the larger human rhythm. Waiting, enduring, managing resources, and calculating the consequences of every decision. Within the castle, the psychological weight of waiting was profound. Each day, without food, increased tension. Soldiers watched for signs of weakness in the walls, while civilians worried that their children would go hungry if stores ran out. The castle, often deep and laboriously maintained, became a crucial lifeline. Water rationing was meticulous. A soldier might receive a single pitcher, a servant half as much. Hygiene became difficult, yet it could not be neglected entirely without risking disease. Every choice, no matter how small, carried consequences that were felt acutely. Outside the walls, Robert's forces confronted the challenge of maintaining pressure without overextending themselves. Troops were rotated carefully. Scouts were dispatched to monitor movement along the river, to ensure that no English reinforcements approached unnoticed. Siege engines were built and repaired using local timber, often harvested under grumbling supervision from nearby villagers. Mortar was mixed slowly and laboriously, a process that demanded patience and precision. Even the noise of pounding hammers and shouted orders carried a subtle psychological effect, intended to unsettle the defenders while reminding civilians nearby of the presence of power. Amid these routines, human resilience and ingenuity were apparent in both camps. Inside the castle, cooks learned to stretch grain and meat to feed more mouths, substituting roots, herbs, and even the leaves of certain plants when rations ran low. Soldiers fashioned improvised weapons and repaired walls with minimal materials. Outside, engineers devised clever ways to undermine walls, though success often came slowly, inch by inch. Scouts found hidden paths to bring intelligence from the surrounding countryside. Every small victory or setback was magnified by the slow rhythm of the siege. The siege also revealed the complex social dynamics of medieval life. Nobles commanded troops, but they also had to navigate expectations of loyalty, honor, and hierarchy. Mercenaries needed to be paid, yet funds were limited, forcing compromises and delaying certain operations. Villagers pressed into service could resent their position, sometimes attempting quiet acts of sabotage or delay. Even clerics in the region mediated between the military and the civilian population, offering counsel, absolution, or logistical advice. Life during a siege was not simple. Every action required careful calculation, whether it was rationing bread or reinforcing a gate. Disease and exposure were as much a threat as arrows or battering rams. Stagnant water, poor sanitation, and crowded conditions inside the castle made outbreaks of dysentery or typhoid likely. Outside, the army contended with exposure to rain, mud, and frost, depending on the season. Casualties often arose, not from battle, but from preventable causes, creating a sense of slow attrition that weighed on morale. The psychological toll was compounded by uncertainty. How long would the siege last? Would supplies run out? Would reinforcements arrive in time? Each question lingered, unanswered, day after day. Despite the monotony, these moments also allowed for unexpected acts of human connection. Soldiers shared meals or told stories by candlelight. Children inside the walls learned to navigate narrow passages and watch for danger with surprising attentiveness. Scouts and engineers outside discovered patterns in the land that allowed them to work more efficiently. Even the slow routines of rationing and repair became an exercise in quiet creativity, revealing the ways humans adapt under sustained pressure. And yet, as you imagine all these details, the rationed bread, the repaired battlements, the slow rotation of soldiers, the careful calculations of food and water, you realize that nothing has yet resolved the central tension. Who will control Stirling Castle, and what will that mean for the surrounding countryside? Every day, both defenders and attackers live in anticipation, wondering if the next dawn will bring a breakthrough, a disaster, or merely another day of endless waiting. As the weeks stretch into months, the siege becomes less a story of dramatic heroics and more a meditation on endurance, patience, and the quiet cruelty of prolonged pressure. The weapons are not only swords and catapults, but time, scarcity, and unrelenting procedure. Lives are shaped, constrained, and sometimes broken, not by a single violent event, but by the slow, methodical pressures of human systems, the machinery of war, law, and survival interwoven with the rhythms of everyday existence. And so, as the sun sets over the hills of Stirling and the silhouette of the castle stretches across the landscape, you are left with a quiet question, lingering in the air like the smoke from the hearths below as you settle back into the world of Stirling Castle. The first thing to notice is the way time itself seems to stretch. Days blend into nights, nights into weeks, and weeks into months. The siege does not arrive with the drama of sudden charges or heroic duels. Instead, it unfolds through quiet, relentless accumulation, the slow march of supply wagons over muddy tracks, the careful rotation of soldiers on walls and in trenches, and the meticulous calculation of grain rations that can mean the difference between life and death. Inside the castle, life has settled into a rhythm dictated by both necessity and fear. Soldiers, clerks, and servants wake before dawn, moving silently through the stone corridors to inspect walls, check stores, and plan for the day ahead. Every ration of food is carefully divided. Every drop of water is measured. Every task is performed with awareness that mismanagement could prove fatal. The castle's granaries are finite. Barrels of salted meat and dried grain are counted daily, and the calculations extend beyond nourishment. They determine how long the castle can withstand the besieging army's patient pressure. The soldiers inside are mostly local garrison troops, supplemented by mercenaries, who are loyal only so long as their pay is maintained. Tension simmers quietly among them. Each soldier knows that they may not be relieved for weeks, that the threat outside is constant, and that every lapse in attention could allow enemies to breach the walls. Nights are the hardest. Damp cold seeps through stone, fires smoulder weakly in the hearths, and the sound of distant activity, clanging hammers, shouting sentries, reminds everyone that time is passing, yet nothing is resolved. Outside, Robert the Bruce's forces mirror this careful patience. There are no dramatic all-out attacks yet. Instead, engineers build and test siege engines, scouts explore approaches to the castle, and messengers ride back and forth over muddy terrain to deliver instructions. Fodder and food must reach the army daily. A single day without supply could trigger desertions or weaken morale. Villagers in surrounding settlements are pressed to provide goods, creating subtle but persistent pressure. Farmers lose grain, livestock, and labor, and their quiet resentment becomes a part of the siege, an invisible current that runs alongside the military operations. Supply lines become the lifeblood of the operation. Both defenders and attackers face the same basic challenge: sustaining themselves under conditions where failure carries deadly consequences. Soldiers inside must balance rationing with the physical labor required to maintain fortifications. Outside, the besiegers must allocate resources for food, shelter, and equipment, while ensuring that the surrounding population does not become so alienated that they withhold supplies entirely. Each group is locked in a slow, mutually dependent struggle, where patience and endurance matter more than individual bravery or skill. The engineers, in particular, play a crucial role in sustaining the siege. Building siege towers, battering rams, and catapults requires timber, iron, and skilled labor. Every component is painstakingly constructed on site, often under the watchful eyes of sentries and scouts. The work is methodical, quiet, and almost hypnotic in its repetition. Even when a ram or engine is completed, it is tested slowly and deliberately. One mistake could cause the machine to collapse, injuring operators or wasting precious resources. The siege is as much an exercise in technical patience as in martial endurance. The psychological weight of the siege cannot be overstated. Defenders watch the daily progress of the besiegers and measure every movement for signs of an impending attack. Soldiers maintain strict vigilance on the walls, their senses attuned to the faintest sounds of excavation, construction, or reconnaissance. Meanwhile, the civilian population inside the walls lives with a constant awareness of scarcity. Children are instructed to fetch water quietly, to carry wood for cooking, and to avoid exhausting the granaries. Each day is a careful negotiation between survival and the inexorable passage of time. Outside, Robert the Bruce demonstrates similar mastery of the slow rhythm of warfare. Rather than risking a premature assault on well-defended walls, he focuses on containment, psychological pressure, and attrition. Scouts bring intelligence from the surrounding countryside, allowing commanders to anticipate resupply efforts or reinforcements to the castle. The besiegers establish semi-permanent camps, rotate troops, and carefully manage their own supplies. Disease, exposure, and boredom are constant threats, and attention to these mundane details proves as critical as any tactical decision. The siege also reveals a delicate interplay between strategy and the natural environment. Scotland's weather is unpredictable. Rain turns paths into quagmires, frost hardens or fractures stone, and wind shapes the trajectory of arrows and projectiles. Commanders on both sides must adapt, sometimes delaying operations or adjusting supply routes to account for sudden changes. This is not glamorous. It is slow, repetitive, and frustrating work. And yet, it is decisive. Miscalculations in timing or resource allocation can determine the eventual outcome without a single battle being fought. Human endurance, creativity, and adaptation are on display at every level. Inside the castle, cooks invent ways to stretch rations, using herbs, roots, and occasionally edible weeds to supplement grains and dried meat. Soldiers and craftsmen repair walls, reinforce gates, and maintain weapons with minimal resources. Outside, besiegers discover hidden paths, improve siege engines, and ration supplies to ensure no gap appears in their cordon. The siege becomes a shared exercise in problem-solving under stress, a slow-motion drama of resource management and human ingenuity. The monotony is punctuated by small but meaningful events. A messenger sneaks through enemy lines with critical intelligence. A wall collapses slightly and must be reinforced immediately. A sudden illness sweeps through the camp, demanding careful quarantine and medical attention. Each incident requires careful attention, patience, and improvisation. The siege is therefore not only a military challenge, but a study in human resilience, planning, and subtle cruelty. The cruelty of prolonged waiting, deprivation, and the knowledge that every day without relief brings greater hardship. The social dynamics within both camps are equally fascinating. Commanders must balance discipline with morale. Soldiers grow resentful if provisions are insufficient. Civilians inside the walls fear shortages and disease. Mercenaries outside must be paid or persuaded to remain loyal. Clerics and advisors mediate disputes, offer spiritual guidance, and sometimes help negotiate local supplies. Every interaction, no matter how minor, influences the siege's slow but inevitable rhythm. And yet, despite all this careful management, the ultimate outcome remains uncertain. Will the defenders' rationing hold long enough for reinforcements to arrive? Will the besiegers' patience and resourcefulness force surrender? Or will the prolonged standoff create a crisis neither side can fully control, perhaps exacerbated by illness, famine, or miscommunication? As you imagine the daily life of this siege, the counting of grain, the rotation of soldiers, the slow maintenance of fortifications, you recognize a quiet, pervasive truth about medieval warfare. It is not the flash of swords or the clang of armor that defines success or failure. It is the patient, disciplined endurance of people on both sides, combined with the relentless passage of time. The Siege of Stirling is a test not only of strategy and strength, but of human resilience, patience, and the subtle pressures of scarcity and obligation. And so, as the castle stands, the soldiers toil, the engineers hammer, and the scouts move through misty woods, one lingering question remains, hanging in the air as the wind brushes the hills around Stirling. As the siege of Stirling Castle continued, the slow, methodical pressures that had defined its first months began to escalate into decisive consequences. The castle's defenders, despite careful rationing, strategic repair of walls, and disciplined rotations, faced the harsh reality of dwindling provisions. Grain bins grew emptier, wells became increasingly relied upon, and every morsel of meat or dried fish was portioned with careful calculation. Hunger, subtle yet pervasive, began to weigh heavily on morale. Soldiers, though trained for combat, were unprepared for the quiet cruelty of scarcity and uncertainty. Civilians, inside women, children, clerks, and blacksmiths, felt it most acutely, their labor stretching beyond endurance to compensate for shortfalls. Their patience worn thin by the endless routine of counting, conserving, and waiting. Outside the walls, Robert the Bruce's forces maintained patient pressure. They understood that a siege was less about immediate conquest and more about attrition, both material and psychological. Food wagons traveled slowly over muddy tracks, and troops rotated to prevent exhaustion, yet disease and fatigue remained constant threats. Scouts reported movements and supplies, while engineers monitored siege engines and assessed vulnerabilities in the castle's defenses. Their actions were methodical, almost hypnotic in their repetition, and yet every day brought subtle changes. A weakened gate here, a collapsed palisade there, a failed supply caravan that might delay operations by hours or days. Time itself became a weapon. Each sunrise and sunset, each measured ration, each rotation of soldiers increased the stakes. The defenders were aware that reinforcement from Allied forces was unlikely to arrive quickly, and the besiegers knew that a single lapse could allow the defenders a brief reprieve. The siege, in this sense, was as much about patience, observation, and subtle strategy as it was about military strength. The human mind and body became the most critical instruments in the prolonged confrontation. One particularly revealing day illustrates the complexity of life within a besieged fortress. Early in the morning, a soldier reports that a section of the outer wall shows signs of weakening. Engineers are called to reinforce the masonry, hauling stones and mortar in shifts, while other soldiers continue their patrols to ensure no enemy approaches unnoticed. Inside the kitchens, a cook carefully divides the remaining rations into smaller portions, knowing that a single miscalculation could lead to unrest or illness. Children fetch water from the well, mindful that too much taken at once could leave later households without enough. Every action is deliberate, repeated, and measured. The siege progresses not through dramatic confrontation, but through countless small acts of endurance and adaptation. The interplay between leadership, human labor, and environmental factors proved crucial. Commanders of the castle had to consider not only enemy activity, but also weather, disease, and the well-being of both soldiers and civilians. Torrential rain turned paths into quagmires, delaying resupply or reinforcement. Frost hardened gates and walls, making repairs more challenging. Illness spread slowly but surely, claiming soldiers who were otherwise fit for duty. Every delay, every minor mishap, carried consequences that rippled through the fragile balance of the siege. Outside, Robert the Bruce carefully managed his forces. He rotated units to prevent fatigue, maintained supply lines despite the challenges of terrain, and coordinated engineers and scouts with precision. The besiegers faced a similar need for patience and endurance. Food had to be rationed, horses tended, and morale maintained, all while maintaining pressure on the castle. Even small victories, such as disrupting a supply caravan or identifying a weakness in the wall, had to be capitalized on efficiently to avoid losing momentum. The siege was, in essence, a slow-moving chess game, where the pieces were people, resources, and time itself. As the weeks turned into months, the psychological impact of this slow grind became evident. Defenders grew increasingly anxious, aware that every passing day, without resupply, increased vulnerability. Soldiers became more alert to minor signs of threat, while civilians adapted routines to conserve energy and resources. Outside, the besiegers monitored the castle carefully, calculating the precise moment when pressure would become unbearable. Every individual, whether soldier, civilian, or commander, participated in an unspoken dialogue with time, scarcity, and endurance. The culmination of the siege did not arrive with the crash of a battering ram or the flare of swords. Instead, It was the cumulative effect of slow attrition that tipped the balance. Food supplies inside the castle reached critically low levels. Soldiers, weakened by hunger, could not maintain the same intensity of patrols or repairs. Civilians faced increasing illness due to inadequate nutrition. Morale, long sustained by hope and discipline, began to erode. Even the strongest walls could not compensate for the gradual depletion of human strength and resources. Eventually, the castle's garrison recognized that continued resistance was unsustainable. Negotiations began quietly, mediated by envoys, familiar with both sides. Terms were discussed for surrender, provisioned by guarantees that lives would be spared and property protected to the extent possible. The castle, long a symbol of resilience and authority, yielded not to dramatic battle, but to the quiet, inexorable pressures of time, supply, and endurance. Robert the Bruce's victory, while strategically significant, highlights the often overlooked realities of medieval warfare. Conquest did not always result from brilliant tactics or heroic charges. More frequently, it emerged from patient calculation, careful resource management, and the human capacity to endure or fail under the pressures of sustained conflict. The Siege of Stirling Castle exemplifies this truth, that human resilience, administrative diligence, and the subtleties of psychological and material pressure can be more decisive than the sudden clash of armies. The aftermath of the siege reveals its human toll. Soldiers and civilians, though relieved from immediate danger, faced the long process of recovery. Fields around the castle had been stripped of supplies, livestock diminished, and trade disrupted. Soldiers suffered from malnutrition, fatigue, and disease. Civilians endured shortages, illness, and the lingering stress of months of uncertainty. Families mourned losses that were invisible to the chronicles, but deeply felt within households. Even the victorious forces had been stretched, their resources depleted, their endurance tested to the limit. Victory in this context was as much about survival as conquest. Beyond the immediate human consequences, the siege had lasting implications for Scottish and English history. Control of Stirling allowed Robert the Bruce to consolidate power in the central lowlands, providing a strategic advantage for future campaigns. The methods employed during the siege, careful management of resources, patient application of pressure, and attention to human endurance, became examples for future military leaders. Yet these lessons were not written in dramatic battle accounts. They were recorded quietly, in chronicles that noted provisions, rotations, negotiations, and human behavior under stress. As you reflect on the siege, it becomes clear that medieval conflict was often less about glory and more about persistence. The machinery of war extended beyond weapons to include logistics, morale, and endurance. Cruelty did not always manifest as bloodshed. It often appeared in the slow deprivation of food, the unrelenting strain on human bodies and minds, and the constant pressure of uncertainty. And yet, in the same moments, resilience, ingenuity, and adaptability shone through. People endured, adapted, and survived through patience, careful calculation, and communal cooperation. The siege of Stirling Castle, in its quiet, meticulous way, demonstrates how history's most significant events are often shaped not by dramatic gestures, but by sustained, incremental pressures. Lives were measured in rationed bread, repaired battlements, and rotations of tired soldiers. The outcome was determined not solely by strength of arms, but by endurance, resourcefulness, and the slow calculus of human patience. And as the castle's gates finally opened, as soldiers marched out and negotiations concluded, one final, lingering thought remains, one that extends far beyond medieval Scotland, beyond armies and fortresses, and into the quiet patterns of human history. Before the first whispers of the plague swept across Europe, life in the 14th century followed a rhythm that seems ordinary from our distant vantage point, yet was delicate, intricate, and easily disrupted. Villages and towns were connected by narrow roads, often little more than tracks for carts and pack horses. Fields stretched outward in patchwork patterns of wheat, barley, and rye, carefully tended by villagers who worked from dawn until dusk. Cattle grazed in commons, while sheep dotted the hillsides. Water was drawn from wells, streams, or rudimentary cisterns. Life was slow, repetitive, and predictable, so much so that deviation from routine often seemed unnatural. Disease was a constant companion, though it was usually seasonal and familiar. Fevers, dysentery, and respiratory infections came and went with the patterns of weather, diet, and sanitation. People had their routines for avoiding illness. Certain herbs were believed protective, fasting was common, and communal baths, though rare, were sometimes used in wealthier towns. Life expectancy was shorter than it is today, yet communities adapted to this reality. Children were numerous because many would not survive to adulthood. Elders, meanwhile, were respected for their accumulated knowledge, particularly in agricultural, medical, and social matters. Stability, predictability, and routine were the cornerstones of survival. The 14th century also bore a hierarchy that structured daily existence. Lords governed lands, collected rents, and dispensed justice. Clergy maintained moral oversight, conducted ceremonies, and managed charity. Merchants and craftsmen supplied goods, often in markets that were tightly scheduled to allow predictability. Peasants labored on the land, provided labor services, or paid rent in kind. Each group relied on the others, forming a delicate web in which the failure of one strand could reverberate across the whole community. In this sense, Europe was a tightly wound system, simultaneously efficient and vulnerable. Trade, though modest by modern standards, connected villages, towns, and regions. Markets in cities like Florence, Ghent, or Bruges drew farmers, merchants, and artisans from surrounding areas. Goods flowed along river systems and coastal routes: grain, wool, salt, iron, cloth, and wine. Caravans moved slowly, following seasonal patterns, and towns developed rules to ensure the smooth functioning of commerce. Life had a rhythm and structure that could be relied upon until it could not. The first hints of disruption came from beyond the continent. Asia, Africa, and the Middle East were linked through trade routes, both overland and maritime. Goods moved with relative regularity, but so did disease. Merchant ships, carrying grain, textiles, and other commodities, sometimes harbored hidden passengers, rats, fleas, and the microorganisms that would prove deadly. For the people of Europe, such risks were invisible. The world seemed stable, predictable, and comprehensible. Disease, when it struck, followed known patterns. Seasonal fevers, localized outbreaks, occasional pestilence, but nothing approaching the scale of what was to come. Medical understanding at the time was limited. Physicians relied on humoral theory, believing that balance among blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile determined health. Treatments ranged from bloodletting and purging to herbal remedies, prayer, and ritual. Hospitals existed, but they were few and usually attached to religious institutions. They cared for the poor and sick, but capacity was limited, and survival often depended more on familial support than on any medical intervention. Daily life was therefore lived in awareness of vulnerability. The human body was fragile, subject to forces beyond control, yet people adapted through routine, ritual, and shared knowledge. Social cohesion was equally vital. Communities were organized around work, worship, and mutual obligation. Families depended on collective effort to maintain fields, tend livestock, and prepare for seasonal cycles. Villages shared in labor, festivals, and religious ceremonies, creating social networks that provided emotional and practical support. Misfortune, whether failed harvest, illness, or local conflict, was borne collectively, with the expectation that neighbors would assist each other. Stability, predictability, and shared understanding of routine made survival possible. But the world was not entirely static. Political pressures, economic changes, and climatic shifts were subtly reshaping Europe. In the early 14th century, a period known as the Great Famine had already disrupted harvests, leading to shortages, price increases, and increased mortality. People had begun to experience that stability could be fragile, that systems of trade, labor, and survival could be strained by factors beyond immediate control. Villagers were alert, cautious, and wary, relying on inherited knowledge to navigate each year's uncertainties. Into this precarious balance came the first faint signs of what would become the Black Death. Ships arrived in southern European ports, carrying cargo, merchants, and animals. The disease itself was invisible, carried by fleas that infested rats, animals, and occasionally humans. The first outbreaks occurred in port cities, unnoticed at first. Symptoms were initially mistaken for familiar illnesses, fevers, swellings, and general malaise. People did not understand the nature of the threat. They interpreted disease through existing frameworks, divine punishment, astrological influence, imbalance of humors. Their responses were as cautious and ritualized as their daily routines. Fasting, prayer, isolation when possible, and treatment with herbs or ointments. The early spread was insidious. A village might report sudden illness, losing 1 or 2 residents, while life in the surrounding countryside seemed unaffected. Markets continued, ships unloaded goods, and travelers moved along familiar routes. Yet, the contagion traveled silently, carried not only by rats and fleas but also by human movement. Merchants, soldiers, pilgrims, and refugees all unknowingly transmitted infection. It was the very interconnectedness that supported trade, agriculture, and survival that now facilitated devastation. By the time the Black Death became widely recognized in Europe in 1347, 1348, people were unprepared for its scale. Mortality rates soared, with estimates ranging from 30% to 50% of affected populations. Entire villages were depopulated, fields abandoned, and social structures strained to breaking point. Traditional support networks were overwhelmed. Clergy could not provide last rites for everyone. Neighbors were unable to bury the dead. Local markets collapsed under disruption. Life, which had seemed orderly and predictable, was suddenly incomprehensible. But before the plague fully took hold, daily life exhibited a fragile, almost haunting normality. Villagers prepared fields, tended livestock, and traded in markets. Townspeople repaired walls, counted coin, and maintained guild regulations. Merchants tallied accounts and negotiated contracts. Soldiers drilled, patrolled, and trained. Each action followed predictable patterns, governed by routine, necessity, and local custom. Yet beneath this ordinary rhythm, the seeds of vulnerability were already present, waiting for the invisible catalyst that would unbalance centuries of careful adaptation. The lesson of this pre-plague period is subtle yet profound. Ordinary, mundane structures of daily life, routines, trade, labor, and social obligations are both the foundation of survival and the conduit for disruption. The interconnectedness that supports human communities also enables catastrophe. Systems that appear stable under normal conditions may become deadly when a small, invisible factor disease, carried by rats or fleas, enters the network. What is remarkable, and often overlooked, is how human resilience is measured not in dramatic heroics, but in the quiet adherence to daily routines, the maintenance of food and water, and the careful management of relationships, labor, and resources. As you imagine the slow rhythm of life before the Black Death, the careful tending of fields, the measured steps of livestock along narrow paths, the daily rituals of trade and worship, a question emerges, subtle but persistent. By the autumn of 1347, the first unmistakable signs of the plague began to appear in Mediterranean ports. Ships arrived from the eastern Mediterranean and Black Sea, their holds carrying not only silk, grain, and spices, but also an uninvited stowaway: fleas infesting rats, themselves carriers of the deadly bacterium Yersinia pestis. The people of Messina, in Sicily, were the first to witness the strange and terrifying pattern. Individuals fell ill seemingly overnight, their bodies marked by painful swellings, buboes often in the armpits or groin. Fever, chills, and vomiting followed, leaving the afflicted weak and incapacitated. Many died within days. At first, residents struggled to interpret the phenomenon. Doctors, bound by humoral theory, attempted to rebalance bodily fluids with bloodletting, purging, and herbal remedies. Priests offered prayers and blessings. Families isolated the sick as best they could, often in small rooms or separate quarters. But the disease was insidious, spreading silently from one house to the next. The streets, once orderly, became pathways of uncertainty. Daily routines, trading at markets, tending fields, attending church, continued alongside the growing fear, highlighting the fragile coexistence of life and impending catastrophe. As the plague spread northward, through Genoa, Venice, and Marseille, the same pattern repeated. Trade and travel, which had sustained the economy for centuries, inadvertently facilitated the disease. Ports became hubs of transmission. Ships from infected regions carried rats and fleas inland, and with them, contagion moved along roads and rivers. Merchants, soldiers, and travelers unknowingly acted as vectors. Villages that had seemed isolated suddenly experienced outbreaks. The rhythm of ordinary life, carefully maintained through routine and habit, faltered under the invisible pressure. The human response was a mixture of routine and improvisation. Wealthier towns attempted quarantine measures, isolating incoming ships or restricting movement. Public officials kept records of illness and death, tallying the toll for both civic administration and moral accounting. Clergy documented the events, often attributing the plague to divine punishment, urging prayer, fasting, and repentance. Ordinary people attempted practical strategies. Herbs were hung in homes, fires were lit to purify air, and travel was avoided. Yet no combination of observation, ritual, or precaution proved sufficient. Life inside towns and villages changed incrementally but significantly. Markets became eerily quiet. Craftsmen could not find apprentices or assistants. Fields went untended as laborers fell ill or died. Families hid from neighbors, fearing contagion, or abandoned homes altogether, leaving belongings to decay. The social fabric, tightly woven through routine and cooperation, began to unravel under the relentless pressure of mortality. Daily routines, the counting of coins, the measuring of grain, the regular observance of religious practices were disrupted, sometimes permanently. Even the administration of justice was affected. Courts, which relied on witnesses, clerks, and jurors, could not function when participants were ill or deceased. Lawsuits were delayed indefinitely. Contracts went unfulfilled. The ordinary machinery of society, the mechanisms that allowed communities to operate, predictably, stalled. People faced the simultaneous challenge of avoiding infection and maintaining the bare necessities of survival, a balance that became increasingly impossible as weeks turned into months. Rural areas were similarly impacted, though in different ways. Villagers who remained on the land faced the dual challenges of isolation and labor shortage. Fields required planting and harvesting. Livestock needed care. Those left behind had to perform tasks once divided among many hands. Grain was harvested later, or left in the field to rot. Animals went unmilked or underfed. Labor shortages forced even elderly or infirm family members to contribute. Life became a struggle of endurance, not combat. The plague did not strike dramatically in single battles. It imposed a slow, grinding pressure that shaped daily life in subtle, relentless ways. Despite these hardships, human ingenuity persisted. Some towns attempted to maintain markets with rotating schedules, minimizing contact. Families developed strategies to provide food without gathering in crowds. Knowledge of infected areas spread through word of mouth, guiding decisions on travel and trade. Clerics and healers adapted rituals to maintain spiritual services without direct contact. Small acts of adaptation, burying bodies quickly, rationing food, avoiding unnecessary travel became crucial. Survival depended less on strength or wealth, and more on awareness, discipline, and careful observation. Yet the human toll continued to mount. Mortality rates in infected towns reached catastrophic levels. Entire households vanished, leaving homes empty and fields fallow. Chroniclers recorded the devastation with a mixture of horror and meticulous accounting, noting not only deaths, but patterns of spread. The Black Death did not discriminate by age or social status. Peasants, merchants, clerics, and nobles were equally vulnerable. The social hierarchy, normally a source of structure and protection, offered little defense against an invisible microscopic agent. This slow unraveling of society created new patterns of migration and behavior. Survivors often abandoned long-held homes and traveled in search of safety or opportunity. Markets and trade networks were temporarily disrupted, forcing communities to adapt locally. Labor shortages created economic consequences. Wages rose for those who remained healthy, while rents and obligations became negotiable out of necessity. In a cruel irony, the same disruption that caused immense suffering also reshaped social and economic structures, demonstrating the interconnectedness of catastrophe and adaptation. One of the quieter, more profound aspects of this period was the psychological impact. Fear became a constant presence. People watched neighbors disappear, sometimes entire families, and wondered whether they would survive another day. Suspicion and mistrust grew, as rumors spread that certain individuals or groups were responsible for the plague's arrival. Yet alongside fear, human resilience persisted. Individuals continued routines where possible, maintained care for children and the elderly, and sought to preserve some semblance of normal life amidst chaos. The tension between despair and adaptation defined daily existence. Medical and clerical authorities struggled to interpret the plague. Physicians debated treatments that ranged from purgatives to herbal infusions. Clergy organized prayers, processions, and fasting, often at great personal risk. Local communities developed informal regulations, sometimes restricting travel or isolating households. The response was fragmented, inconsistent, and often ineffective. Yet it reflected a remarkable human effort to impose order on an incomprehensible threat. Survival depended on both adherence to familiar routines and flexible adaptation to new dangers. As the Black Death spread further into northern and central Europe, the slow grind of disruption became more pronounced. Towns emptied, harvests failed, and labor shortages reshaped local economies. Trade routes contracted, yet some movement persisted, carrying both goods and disease to new areas. Communities learned to live under continuous threat, balancing the need for sustenance with avoidance of infection. Life, once predictable and orderly, had entered a new, uncertain rhythm. And so, as the plague moved inexorably across the continent, one cannot help but observe the quiet, pervasive mechanisms through which it affected daily life. The devastation was not sudden spectacle, but a slow, methodical unraveling of routines, habits, and social structures. Hunger, disease, fear, and the need for survival coalesced into an unrelenting pressure that tested human endurance at every level. Small adaptations, rationing, avoidance, modified rituals were vital, yet the ultimate outcome remained largely beyond individual control. As you imagine the slow progression of the Black Death ships arriving in port cities, villagers hiding indoors, markets growing quiet, fields lying fallow, you recognize that the plague's impact was as much about interruption of daily life as about death itself. Every routine, every habitual action, became a site of uncertainty and risk. Human resilience was exercised not through heroics but through patience, careful observation, and subtle adaptation to the relentless pressure of an invisible threat. As the Black Death slowly swept across Europe, killing millions and leaving towns eerily quiet, the survivors began to face a new challenge: rebuilding a world that had been irrevocably altered. Fields that once provided reliable harvests lay fallow. Markets and trade routes had shrunk, forcing communities to rely on local production and ingenuity. Labor, which had been abundant, was suddenly scarce, and surviving workers discovered newfound leverage over landlords and employers. The familiar routines of daily life had been shattered, yet people were compelled to reconstruct them, to adapt, and to endure. Villages that had been partially or completely depopulated slowly repopulated, sometimes with migrants from other areas seeking land, opportunity, or simply safety. Families that had lost multiple members struggled to re-establish agricultural productivity. Fields needed ploughing, seeds had to be sown, and livestock replaced. The pace was measured and slow. Recovery was rarely dramatic, it was incremental, carried out by hands calloused from labor, and minds weighed down by grief. Survival required both persistence and careful attention to detail. Every day was a quiet exercise in endurance. In towns, the effects of population loss were equally transformative. Trade slowly resumed, yet with smaller markets and fewer buyers and sellers, craftsmen discovered that their services were more valuable. As skilled labor had become scarce, apprentices were in short supply, prompting master craftsmen to train more intensively or adjust expectations. Guild regulations, which had once structured economic activity rigidly, were reconsidered in light of necessity. Daily routines, craft production, market days, delivery of goods were recalibrated to accommodate the new social and demographic realities. Life resumed, but it was a life reshaped by experience, loss, and adaptation. Survivors also had to contend with psychological and social consequences. Fear of contagion persisted long after the initial wave of the plague passed. Communities instituted new rituals for hygiene, burial, and quarantine, sometimes codifying practices that had been improvised during the outbreak. Churches and hospitals, overburdened during the crisis, became centers of both care and administration, facilitating recovery, while attempting to prevent future outbreaks. Even the rhythm of prayer, work, and leisure subtly shifted, reflecting an increased awareness of mortality and vulnerability. Economic structures were transformed as well. Land that had previously been overworked could now be farmed more sustainably, thanks to the scarcity of labor. Wages rose for those who remained, as landlords competed for workers capable of tending fields, managing livestock, or performing skilled labor. In some regions, social hierarchies were challenged as peasants found new leverage, occasionally negotiating better conditions or autonomy. These adjustments, though often small and uneven, reflected a slow, systemic shift caused by the pressure of the Black Death. Ordinary routines had been interrupted, but new patterns emerged, guided by pragmatism and necessity. Even the administration of justice and governance adapted. Courts, which had collapsed under absenteeism and illness, resumed operations with adjusted procedures. Local authorities developed protocols for managing missing or deceased citizens. Tax collection, previously predictable, became more flexible, reflecting the reduced population and economic contraction. In many ways, medieval Europe had been forced to rethink its ordinary structures of governance and daily life, learning lessons about resilience, flexibility, and adaptation under extreme pressure. One striking aspect of recovery was the human capacity to rebuild social networks. Families reunited, neighbors cooperated, and communities re-established routines that, while altered, provided stability and security. Markets reopened, guilds resumed oversight, and agricultural cycles were gradually restored. Yet memory of the plague remained, shaping behavior for decades. Oral histories, local chronicles, and religious interpretations reinforced lessons learned. Vigilance against disease, reliance on observation and adaptation, and careful attention to routine could be as vital as strength or authority. The Black Death also demonstrated the subtle, long-term consequences of population disruption. Land use changed, labor dynamics shifted, and economic mobility increased for survivors. Those who endured the crisis acquired new bargaining power, particularly in regions where labor shortages persisted for decades. Communities learned to distribute work more efficiently, to manage resources with greater precision, and to prioritize essential survival activities. Daily life, once predictable, had become a careful balance between risk, resource management, and adaptation to new realities. Yet the plague's legacy was not only economic and social, it was also deeply human. Survivors carried memories of loss, grief, and fear. These experiences influenced relationships, community cohesion, and cultural practices. Rituals surrounding death, disease, and hygiene were adjusted, sometimes codified into law or customary practice. People adapted to a world in which sudden disruption could occur, learning to observe, plan, and endure in ways that were subtle, incremental, and sometimes invisible. Ordinary acts caring for family, tending livestock, managing stores of grain, became sites of resilience and survival. In some regions, recovery was slower, reflecting both local conditions and the intensity of the initial outbreak. Northern Europe, for instance, faced repeated waves of plague in subsequent decades, each testing the endurance and adaptability of communities. In cities, overcrowding and inadequate sanitation made containment challenging. Villages, although smaller, developed social norms for dealing with absent or deceased neighbors. Across Europe, ordinary routines were continuously recalibrated in response to an invisible and persistent threat. Survival depended not on dramatic heroism, but on steady, disciplined action, rationing, careful observation, and the quiet management of human and material resources. What is remarkable, and often overlooked, is the subtlety of the Black Death's impact. Unlike battles or dramatic political events, the plague reshaped human life through disruption of ordinary routines, slow attrition of population, and the necessity of adaptation. It was not a spectacle, but a persistent pressure that touched every household, field, and market. Survival required patient observation, improvisation, and endurance, qualities that defined the rhythm of life in its aftermath. The scale of change was immense, precisely because it operated through the invisible channels of daily existence rather than through immediate violence or drama. And yet, amid loss and disruption, the Black Death revealed human resilience in its quietest, most persistent form. Families rebuilt farms, markets resumed, and labor systems adjusted. Communities developed new social norms, trade patterns, and resource management strategies. Rituals evolved, governance adapted, and ordinary routines, though forever altered, were re-established. The lesson is subtle but profound. Survival and recovery often rely not on extraordinary events, but on the painstaking reconstruction of daily life, one careful decision at a time. As you imagine the slow rebuilding of Europe, the tilled fields, the reopened markets, the cautious negotiation of labor, the measured rituals of religious observance, a reflection emerges that transcends time and place. Life, fragile as it may be, persists through patience, adaptation, and the quiet persistence of ordinary human action. Crises as immense as the Black Death reshape societies not only through loss, but through the enduring capacity of people to observe, calculate, and endure. And so, as villages refill, fields are cultivated again, and trade cautiously resumes, one last question lingers in the air, subtle, yet weighty. To understand the quiet persistence of knowledge in the Middle Ages, it is necessary to step inside the walls of a monastery. Imagine a stone building set in a remote landscape, rolling hills, thick forests, and a river winding through a valley. The monastery itself is austere but carefully constructed, with cloisters surrounding a central courtyard, a chapel rising at its heart, and dormitories, refectories, and libraries tucked within the surrounding wings. The air is cool and carries the faint scent of damp stone, ink, and candle wax. Outside, the world may be unpredictable, chaotic, or dangerous, but inside these walls, life follows a rhythm, measured by bells, prayers, and labor. Monks in the 12th and 13th centuries divided their days meticulously. Each day began before dawn with the ringing of the first bell, calling them to the matins, the night prayer. Cloaked in their simple robes, they moved quietly through the corridors, performing ablutions, reciting prayers, and meditating. Following matins came lauds, the morning prayer, and then breakfast, a simple meal of bread, porridge, or cheese. Daily work followed, carefully structured according to the monastic rules, such as the Benedictine order, which prescribed the balance of prayer, labor, and study. Some monks spent their days in the library, copying manuscripts or studying the writings of classical authors. Their tools were basic: quills, ink made from oak galls and iron salts, and parchment or vellum. Each letter required careful attention, each line measured to avoid mistakes. Knowledge was precious, rare, and fragile. A single error could ruin a text, while the survival of important works often depended on these painstaking acts of transcription. In a quiet sense, the preservation of human understanding rested on the shoulders of men performing repetitive, meticulous labor. Other monks were responsible for tending the gardens and orchards. They grew herbs for medicine and food, maintained vegetables and grains, and sometimes managed livestock. Their work was physically demanding yet structured, often punctuated by periods of prayer. The monks understood that survival depended on both spiritual discipline and practical skill. Life in the monastery was a careful equilibrium, faith and labor intertwined, each supporting the other. Astronomy and observation were among the more specialized pursuits of some monastic communities. For monks in the 13th century, the heavens were not merely poetic, they were practical. The stars, moon, and planets served as markers of time, guides for agriculture, and tools for predicting religious festivals, particularly Easter, which required careful calculation of the lunar calendar. Observation required patience, careful record-keeping, and attention to minute detail. Monks constructed simple instruments such as astrolabes, quadrants, and sundials to measure celestial movements. Their lives were quiet, repetitive, and meticulous, yet they were contributing to a growing understanding of the universe. The act of recording celestial movements was tedious by necessity. Monks observed the night sky for hours, often in cold and damp conditions. They recorded positions of stars and planets with painstaking accuracy, noting deviations, conjunctions, and patterns that would later inform calendars and navigation. Mistakes were minimized through repetition and careful verification. The process was neither glamorous nor immediately rewarding. It was slow, deliberate work that required concentration, patience, and long-term commitment. Daily life in the monastery was further constrained by ritual and obedience. Monks were subject to strict hierarchical structures, led by an abbot who oversaw spiritual, practical, and administrative matters. Decisions were made collectively in some respects, yet discipline was enforced rigorously. Silence was observed, for long periods, to allow contemplation and study. Meals were eaten in communal refectories, often without conversation, accompanied only by readings from scripture. Every action, from tending a garden to copying a manuscript, was embedded within a framework of discipline and purpose. The tools and methods of monastic observation reflected the careful integration of faith and reason. Instruments were simple yet effective. Quadrants and astrolabes allowed measurements of altitude and position. Sundials provided local time. Observations were recorded meticulously in charts and tables, often annotated with notes in Latin. Through repetition, verification, and attention to detail, monks produced records that were not only useful for immediate religious purposes, but also preserved knowledge for future generations. Their work, though quiet and methodical, became the foundation for advances in astronomy and mathematics centuries later. Monastic life also involved a deep connection to the cycles of nature. Monks woke with the sun, slept shortly after sunset, and structured labor according to daylight and season. Agricultural work required careful observation of soil, weather, and crop health. Water needed to be drawn and stored, fields plowed, and herbs harvested at precise times. Even as the focus turned toward celestial observation, the rhythms of the earth remained central to survival. The monastery was a microcosm of broader medieval life, a carefully managed system of labor, observation, and adaptation to both natural and spiritual laws. The social aspect of monastic life, though subtle, was equally important. Monks depended on cooperation, trust, and shared purpose. Tasks were divided according to skill and ability. Novices learned from more